Greetings and welcome to 3dmotive.com. My name is Alan Thorne and I'll be your instructor on this comprehensive course introducing you to the Unity 5 game engine and its exciting feature set. In this module we'll explore terrain systems, audio functionality and other asset workflows. Assets generally are critical to working in Unity, whether you're working with meshes, textures, materials, scenes, animations and other data. You'll certainly need to know about assets. Here we'll see how to import and configure both meshes and textures optimally from 3D modeling software. We'll examine how to create and sculpt terrains for developing impressive outdoor landscapes that we can explore in first-person mode. In doing this, we'll learn how to populate a landscape with trees, water, grass and more details, alongside other issues like collision detection. And then we'll move on to see Unity 5's new audio features, including the audio mixer window, giving us control over volume levels, sound effects and a lot more besides. By the end of this part, you'll be strongly positioned to create realistic exterior environments, complete with music and sound effects that'll take your games to the next level. So let's jump in and get started. So let's get started. In front of me I have here an empty Unity project with a completely blank Unity scene open here in front of me. And I want to take this opportunity to talk about mesh assets and textures, and in particular how you can get your content into Unity. Now already we have seen how to create basic objects in Unity. For example, I can create a floor. I can do that by choosing Game Object, 3D Object, and I can choose either a plane or a quad in this case. I'm going to choose plane, so I'm going to add a plane to the scene, and that gives me a basic floor. And notice it's square, it's completely square here, so it's a basic primitive. I can also create cubes by choosing Game Object, 3D Object, and Cube, and here we get a cube in the scene. And likewise, I can create other kinds of primitives such as spheres, capsules, cylinders. So I'm going to just choose a sphere here. We've seen how to get basic primitives into a scene like that. But these objects are really quite basic and quite simple. They're just basic geometric primitives, and very often we will want something a lot more complex. For example, if I double click on the Viking scene that we have seen before, so I'm just going to double click on the Viking scene, and no, I don't want to save these changes, so I'm going to say no, and that will open up the Viking scene in the Unity editor. Now if we take a look at this scene, we can see that the content in here is a lot more complicated than the basic primitives we have seen. For example, this little house here, I'm just going to press F on the keyboard to focus on that house. This house is in no way a standard geometric primitive. This is being modeled intentionally by an artist. In fact, if I select this model here and I move over here to the Object Inspector, you can see here under the Mesh Renderer component and this Mesh Filter component that we have a lot more details. In fact, if I just expand this to have a look at the Mesh parameter, and I just select the Mesh object here, it will select the mesh for me here in the project panel. And you can see here, if I select this Mesh object, that we get a preview here in the Object Inspector. So this object has been imported into Unity. It has been first modeled in an external application, a modeling application. I don't know which one, but it has been modeled in an external application and then imported into Unity. So Unity is intended to work with other software. And what I want to do now is to show you how you can get your content out of a 3D modeling software and into Unity so that you can get up and running with some external models. So I've jumped over here to a web browser window, and I want to direct you to two applications in particular that you can get your hands on completely free of charge in order to create 3D content for your games. One of them is Blender, which is an enormous 3D application. So you can get access to Blender here by navigating to this URL, which is www.blender.org. You can see that here in the address bar here, and all you have to do is click on the download button to get access to the Blender software. This course will not be going into the details on how to use Blender, but if you are interested, you can check out the 3dmotive.com course on an introduction to Blender, as well as other 3D software available, including Maya and 3ds Max. Also, if you're interested in creating 3D characters for your games, I'm going to jump over to this other tab here, and you will see that there's software called makehuman.org. You can see that here in the address bar. And this software allows you to quickly generate characters that you can import both into Blender and into Unity. I'm just going to be quickly showing you how to get content from both of these applications and import them into Unity. So I'm going to jump over to Blender and get started. So here I am in the Blender software, and I'm using version 2.73 here. And what I have in front of me in the user perspective viewport is a 3D character that I have simply generated in the MakeHuman software and have imported into Blender. And you can import your 3D characters into Blender just by choosing File and choosing Import. And then you can select MakeHuman or .mhx file there. And if you don't see that option, you can activate it by simply going to User Preferences. And in the User Preferences dialog in the add-on section, you can search for MakeHuman and put a tick in that box to activate the MakeHuman add-on. So I'm just going to close this window here. Now, when you have finally created software or created models in Blender, you will want to export them from Blender or your 3D modeling software, whichever package you are using. You will want to export them from here in a file that Unity can accept. Unity accepts FBX files, and that's the file I recommend you export to when creating your models. So in Blender, the first thing to do is when you are modeling, make sure that you are using metric units. So over here in the World tab, under this section here, you will see down here under Units, we have the option of None, Metric or Imperial. So please make sure that you select metric units because Unity uses the metric system. The next thing you want to do is to select the parts of your model, or all of it, that is going to be exported here from the software. So I'm just going to drag my mouse over everything here to select all of this in the scene. You can see now that all of this has been selected. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to choose File and then Export. And I'm going to select FBX from the menu here. You could also use the collada.dae format, but I'm going to be using the FBX format. So I'm going to select FBX here, and we get this menu appear here. Now what I'm going to do is scroll down to just check out the settings on the left here. So on this panel, you want to make sure that the version is set to FBX 7.4 binary. You can also choose 6.1 ASCII, but here I'm going to use the later version, the 7.4 version. Then I want to make sure that selected objects is ticked. If you do not check this box here, then Blender is going to export everything in the scene, whether it is selected or not. But I just want to export the selected objects. I'm going to leave the scale here at 1. This gives me the opportunity to uniformly scale the mesh up or down, increasing or shrinking its size. 1 leaves the mesh at its default size, basically. So then I'm going to leave these other settings at their defaults. I'm going to make sure that Apply Transform is ticked. And on these options here, I'm going to make sure that Mesh is selected. You can hold down the Shift key to export other things in the selection. So for example, if I had selected a camera in the scene, I could hold down the Shift key and select that to export both the camera and the mesh. But I don't want to do that. I just want to import the mesh that I have selected. I'm going to make sure that a tick is also in Apply Modifiers to bake down all the modifiers that might be applying to the mesh. And if I have animation on the object, in this case I don't, but if I did have animation, I would want to make sure that baked animation was enabled, but I'm going to disable it since the object has no animation at all. Once these settings are configured as we have them here, I'm just going to save the file to man.fbx and then just choose Export FBX. And when I do that, Blender will export my character model to the selected file, and that is now ready to import into Unity. We'll see how to do that next. So I've returned back here to the Unity editor in a completely new and empty scene, and this is going to be an exercise in importing a character model, the one we've just exported, into Unity, and you will find the completed project here in the course companion files in the folder char import. So I'm just going to minimize Unity just for one moment, and you can see on the desktop here that we have two lots of files. We have the man.fbx that we exported from Blender, and we also have a folder here called textures, which includes the generated textures from MakeHuman. So these are the textures that MakeHuman created that are going to be applied to the model in Unity. So I'm just going to move this out of the way and then just bring back the Unity window here. So here we have this Unity window, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to resize it just for a moment. And the very first thing I want to do is to import the textures. Generally, you want to import the textures before the model. So I'm going to click on this folder and drag and drop the textures over here into the project panel, and then release my mouse. So that will go ahead and just import the textures here into Unity. And now they have been successfully imported. The next thing that I want to do is to actually import the character model. And again, that's just a drag and a drop operation. So here is the man.fbx, and I'm going to drag and drop that into the project panel. And Unity will go ahead and import the character model. Now when that is completed and the model has been imported, Unity may show you this dialog here called the normal map settings dialog. And what this is doing is it says that basically Unity has scanned through this model here, this model of a man, and has detected the textures that it needs in the textures folder. But it has identified some of the textures as being normal maps. And Unity is trying to tell you that though it knows these textures should be normal maps, they haven't been configured to be used as normal maps. And just to clarify, normal maps allow our textures, our materials, to have a certain amount of bumpiness and roughness. So if you get this dialog, all you need to click on is the button that says Fix Now. So I'm going to choose Fix Now. That will go ahead and configure the normal map textures to be normal maps. So I'm just going to expand the Unity window back again to fill the recording screen. And if I double click on the textures folder and I select, for example, this map here, which is a normal map, and I select that and look at its settings in the object inspector, you can see that Unity has automatically configured the texture type to be a normal map as opposed to an ordinary map such as this one, which is configured as texture. So I'm going to go back to the main assets folder here and select the man character mesh. So I'm going to select that, and you can see here in the preview panel that we have this man character mesh now successfully imported in the scene. I can add him simply to the scene by just dragging and dropping the character mesh in the scene. I'm going to set him to the world origin here and just focus the camera in on this character. So you can see this character here in the scene. And he's looking pretty good. I mean, that's all set up, looking quite nice. I think that I have forgotten to import the character eyes. You can see here that this appears to be empty. But apart from that, the mesh is working pretty nicely. So you can see here that the skin right now is looking a bit shiny and a bit plastic. And this is because the way the skin material is configured. So I'm just going to open up this materials folder, and Unity has generated this automatically for us. So I'm going to double click the materials folder and have a look at the materials that we have. So I have this, for example, jeans material. I can select this jeans material, and right now this is selected as a legacy shader, and I don't really want that kind of material. We're going to be going into the details of materials in a later section of the course, but right now we can change this legacy material to a standard material. So by clicking in this drop down box here under shader, I can select this and choose standard. When I do this, the appearance of these trousers changes slightly. We get a certain amount of shininess here, and if I rotate my view around, you can see that these jeans are a bit too shiny really. We can fix that easily by moving over here to the material properties, and under the smoothness section I can just reduce my slider to make them slightly less smooth, and now we've got a much more realistic appearance for those jeans. And we want to do the same thing for the skin material. So I'm going to select the skin material here. And again, I'm going to reduce the smoothness setting. And when I do that, we're getting a much more realistic appearance for that skin for the character model in the viewport here. So here we've seen the basics of importing a mesh into a Unity scene and configuring its materials. Now it's time to move on. Now in this part of the course, what I want to do is show you how you can create terrain in Unity. In Unity, terrain is simply a structure that you can use to build landscapes, including valleys, mountain environments, snowy terrains, forests, and all kinds of other exterior environments. I've opened up the Viking Village project here, and you can see that in the Unity editor in front of me. And over here in the hierarchy panel, under the Quality Manager, I have selected the first person controller. I've selected that object and I've just simply moved it outside of the Viking Village and into this area here, the region outside. The reason I have done that is because when you play the Viking Village, the boundaries of the level will prevent you from leaving the village. So I've just moved the first person controller out here into this area, and this constitutes the terrain of the level. And if I press the play button on the toolbar, I can use the first person controller to wander around the terrain. In fact, let me just press Control P, and what I'm going to do is to switch to the Game tab and maximize the Game tab here with Shift Spacebar, and then press play on the toolbar. So I'm going to press play, and now you can see I am able to wander around this terrain quite freely. So I can just wander over here towards this mountainous landscape, and it looks quite pretty. I'm just going to hold down the Shift key to run here in the first person controller. And as I do this, I can ascend the mountain terrain here. So I'm just running up here and running to the very top of the mountain terrain, and I can look down on the village and the rest of the landscape. So all of this landscape here, this bumpy mountainous terrain, is created using the Unity terrain tools. So we're going to be having a look at how to create these environments, because the terrain tools make it very, very easy to quickly get up and running with a whole terrain for your exterior level. So we're going to be looking at how to use these. So I'm just going to press Control P to stop playback here and just come out of this maximized view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to a completely new and empty project and then get started at creating a terrain. So here we have a completely empty and new Unity project ready to start a terrain object. So here I have an empty scene, and you can see that we've already got a default sky created for us here. And I'm going to create a new terrain object by simply choosing Game Object, 3D Object, and then selecting Terrain from the menu. And when I do that, I'm just going to double click on Terrain to center that in the viewport here. And what you can see in front of us is a completely new terrain. Down here in the bottom right hand side, you will see that Unity is trying to calculate something for us, and that is partly to do with lighting, and we're going to be exploring lighting in a later part of the course. But right now we have this terrain object centered here in the viewport, and really it looks like just an ordinary plain object. In fact, really there's no difference at all in terms of appearance. However, a terrain object is a highly tessellated plane. That means it has lots of faces and vertices, allowing us to deform it. Now, if we wanted to come in and start shaping this terrain, we could simply do that by coming over here to the Object Inspector with the terrain object selected. And this left-hand button here is the Terrain Sculpting Tools. So if I click on this left icon, I can simply click anywhere within the terrain, and when I do that, you see I'm starting to deform and starting to sculpt the terrain and shape it. But I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm going to press Ctrl Z on the keyboard to undo that and restore the terrain back to its default state here. The first thing I want to do is to switch over here to the Settings tab on the Terrain Inspector. So I'm going to click on the Settings tab. That is the cog icon here, which is the last button on this menu. So I'm going to select that, and this allows us to control some overarching parameters for the terrain. And in fact, once you create a terrain, this is the first place that you want to go. So I'm going to scroll right down to the bottom under the category that says Resolution, and you can see here that we have a terrain width, length and height, and these are specified in meters. So terrain width and length are both 500 by 500 meters. This gives us an absolutely massive terrain, and typically this is far larger than you want it to be. So I'm going to reduce these settings. For the width and the length, I'm going to specify a value of 256 by 256. This produces a terrain of a much smaller and more sensible size. I'm going to press F on the keyboard just to frame this terrain. So now I've created a terrain at 256 by 256. As to the height, I'm going to leave this perhaps at 600. I can easily reduce this if I want to, if I find that my terrain is going to be too high. But this effectively specifies the maximum height that the terrain can reach. So if you're going to be creating mountains, then a mountain can be no taller than 600 meters. So I'm perfectly fine with these settings as they are. Now I could scroll back up here and go back to this left-hand side option and start sculpting the terrain manually. But to get started, I often find it easier to use a height map. And that is at the bottom of this settings panel here. You will see we have a height map option in which we can import an image file that defines the height and the elevation of the terrain using grayscale colors. So I'm going to create a height map manually using Photoshop, and I'll jump over to Photoshop quickly to show you how you can do that. Here I've jumped over to Adobe Photoshop, ready to create an image texture to be used as a height map for our terrain in Unity. Before I go ahead and do that, I just want to make you aware that if you don't have Photoshop, you can download an alternative absolutely free of charge. I'm just going to bring up a web browser window here, and you can get access to a free image editor by going to www.gimp.org, and by clicking on the download button you can download the latest version of that software, and you can use it to create both height maps and textures. But going forwards, I'm going to be using Adobe Photoshop. Just going to minimize this window. Now because this is not primarily a Photoshop course, I'm not going to be going into the details of how Photoshop works. I'm simply going to show you quickly how we can generate a height map for a Unity terrain. So to get started, we move up here to the File menu and choose File and choose New, or press Ctrl N on the keyboard or Command N on a Mac. So I'm going to press Ctrl N here, and in the New Image dialog box we have options here to specify the width and height of the terrain in pixels. Our terrain is specified as being 256 by 256 meters, so I'm going to leave the pixel dimensions the same here. For the background of the image, it should be set to white, so I'm going to leave it as white and then choose OK. That will produce a white image here, which is 256 by 256 pixels. I'm going to press D on the keyboard to reset my color scheme to the default colors. That means down here the colors are going to change to black for the primary color and white for the background color here. That's important to set for the option we're going to be using next. So up here I'm going to move to the filter menu and I'm going to choose render, and then I'm going to choose clouds. This will generate a cloud pattern in the image here that you can see in front of me, and I'm pretty happy with this general cloud pattern that we have here. Now I'm just going to save this image, and I can do that by choosing File and then choose Save, or press Ctrl S on the keyboard. When I choose Save, we get the Save Options dialog appear. Now for the options here, this file should be saved as a Photoshop RAW image. To do that, I'm going to move down here to the Save As type, and in this drop down I'm going to change it from PNG to Photoshop RAW, that's .raw. So I'm going to select Photoshop RAW here and name this image height map. In fact, I have one here already. I'm just going to overwrite that and choose Save. It asks me, do I want to replace the image? Yes, I do. Now when I do that, I get the option in this dialog here to choose either interleaved order or non-interleaved order. Now be careful with the option that you choose here. I'm going to choose non-interleaved order. If you choose interleaved order, your terrain is going to look messy. So it's important here that you specify non-interleaved order, and then I'm going to choose OK. And in doing that, I have now created a height map that's ready to import into Unity, and we'll see how to do that next. So I've jumped back into Unity now, ready to import our height map. I've simply clicked on the Import Raw button down here in the Object Inspector with the terrain selected, and it gives me the option to pick a height map to use. So I'm going to select the height map we've imported here, which is heightmap.raw, and select that and then choose Open. Now when I do that, we get an Import Height Map dialog appear here, and we have to change some of these settings. So I'm going to leave the terrain size, the width and the height, the width and the length, beg your pardon, at 256. The height, which is the Y value, is going to be left at 600 for now. For these settings here, I'm going to leave these as default, but the width and height I'm going to change to be the dimensions of our image, which is 256. And for the byte order parameter, I'm going to change that from Mac to Windows. And then finally, I'm going to choose Import. Now, when I do this, Unity will calculate the height of the terrain based on the height map. And what you see in the viewport here is a completely messy and very upsy-downsy terrain based on the image that we have imported. The height map defines the elevation of the terrain. The black areas in the image represent recessions, the pushing down part, and the white pixels represent the pushing up part. Now this is too upsy-downsy for my taste. I want to reduce the height of the terrain. Right now you can see the terrain height is specified at 600, representing the maximum height it can reach. I'm going to reduce this from 600 to 100 and press enter on the keyboard. And when I do that, you see that we get a much more sensible terrain here now. It's still quite jagged and rough, but it's much more sensible looking. So I'm going to leave it at that setting here. And next up, I'm going to consider the terrain sculpting tools to refine the appearance and improve it. Here I want to consider the terrain sculpting tools to refine the appearance of our terrain. These tools are accessible when the terrain is selected and you move here into the Object Inspector and you choose this leftmost button here. This will allow us to push and pull areas of the terrain. Effectively, it's allowing us to paint into the height map to change the form and the structure of the terrain. So I'm just going to get a good view of this terrain, and perhaps I'm going to reduce the height of some of these mountains. Now to do this, I'm going to make sure that I'm using a brush here. So here in the brushes panel, we can choose the shape of the brush that we want to use. I'm going to start by using perhaps a slightly rougher brush like this one here. We can control the size of the brush using this slider. So if I wanted to make the brush really small, I just simply drag that to the left and we get a tiny brush, and you can see the changes I'm making really just affect a small part of the terrain. Or I can increase the size of the brush and affect much larger areas here. So I'm just affecting these areas, roughing this up a little bit. And by default, left clicking with the mouse will elevate the terrain, but you can hold down the Shift key on the keyboard and then paint to reduce the height of the terrain. And the opacity slider here, this defines the strength of the brush that I'm using. So if I reduce this down to 0 and click into this terrain, it has practically no effect at all. And if I raise this to the right hand side, it's going to affect the terrain most strongly. So I'm going to move it somewhere down the middle here, and I'm going to just reduce the height of some of this here. And I'm going to change my brush now to a smooth round brush and just start to reduce the height of some parts of the terrain, like so. The next thing I want to do is that this terrain is still quite rough, and I want to smooth this out. Now to do that, I can use the smooth brush, and that's the third brush on this panel here. So I'm going to click on the smooth brush on this one here, and all I have to do now is just paint over the terrain, and you can see straight away it's just smoothing out the details on this terrain, just making it a little bit smoother and slightly less rough, and that's something that I want to apply to this terrain here. So I'm happy with this kind of arrangement that we've got here. If I weren't, I could simply go back to the sculpting tools, raise and lower the terrain and smooth it out where necessary. If I don't want it smooth anymore, I can simply go back to the sculpting tools and I can simply choose one of these rougher brushes along here and start to rough out the terrain, perhaps using a slightly smaller brush to insert some extra roughness and detail in here. So maybe something kind of like this, just to add a little bit of extra roughness into here. So once you have an arrangement of a terrain that you like, you're ready to move on. The problem with this terrain right now is that it's completely grey, dull and formless. It's time for us to start painting some texture detail onto this terrain. We've now sculpted a terrain to our liking, and the next thing we want to do is to texture paint onto the terrain to make the surface appear to be made from grass or rock or whatever other kind of terrain we want. Now typically at this stage you would import your own texture assets to paint your own terrains, but for this demonstration I'm going to be using the built-in assets that Unity provides, and there are two different places where we can get access to terrain assets. The first one is built into Unity already, and we can access some terrain assets by choosing Assets, Import Package, and we can choose the Environment Asset Package. So I'm going to select that package, and then once selected we get the Import Package dialog appear, and we can see that here. I'm just going to leave all of these checkboxes ticked at their defaults and then choose Import. And when I do that, Unity will go ahead and import a range of terrain assets that we can use. Now, once imported, I want to import some additional packages, and these are not available from the regular assets that we've seen already. We have to go to the asset store to get them, but they are available for free. So now I'm going to get the terrain assets from the asset store. To do that, I can move up here to the File menu and choose Window, and then choose Asset Store, or press Ctrl 9 on the keyboard. So I'm going to select the Asset Store, and we get the Asset Store appear here, and I'm going to search for Terrain Assets, and then press Enter on the keyboard. And when I do that, the Asset Store will be searched, and right here in the top left hand side you can see from Unity Technologies we have the terrain assets, which includes 3D models and vegetation. So I'm going to select the terrain assets here, and we get a bit more information about them. We get 12 different tree types, some additional brushes, 6 grass types and 22 terrain textures. So really quite a fun pack of assets that we can use there. I'm going to import them into the project by clicking the Import button you can see here from the Asset Store. Unity will go ahead and decompress those assets, and once again I'm going to accept all of these defaults and choose the Import button. And when I do that, Unity will go ahead and import a whole load of terrain assets more into our project, and this will give us the ability to add all kinds of different textures to our terrain object. So I will see you once these assets have loaded, and then we're ready to begin painting our terrain. So now I want to paint our terrain with some terrain textures, and if you look down here in the project panel, you will see that we have a terrain assets folder as well as the standard assets folder. If I double click on the standard assets folder, you can see we have an environment folder, and inside that we have access to a range of different assets that we are going to be using for our terrain. These were imported by choosing Assets, Import Package and Environment. But also we have a separate folder down here called Terrain Assets, which gives us some additional terrain assets, and these we downloaded from the Assets Store. In fact, in the Textures folder, you can see the range of different textures that we have, which we can paint onto this terrain here to give it an appearance. So what I want to do now is to select the terrain in the scene and move over here to the Paintbrush tab, which is the Paint Texture tab, and this will allow us to select a brush and choose a texture to paint onto this terrain. The first thing we want to do is to add some additional texture brushes. So these textures down here that we can paint onto the terrain, we need to add over here in this texture slot to add them as brushes that we can paint. So here in this texture section there is a button that says Edit Textures. I'm going to click on that button, and then from the menu I'm going to choose Add Texture. When I click Add Texture, we get the Add Texture Terrain button, or the dialog appear here, and we can specify two textures to apply in here, and these are Albedo or Diffuse Map, and the Normal Map if we want to have bumpiness. Now right now for these textures that we have here, I don't have a normal map. We could generate one, and I'm just going to quickly show you how you could generate a normal map from a texture here. I'm just going to close the Add Terrain Texture dialog, and for example for this grass texture, let's just choose for example this standard grass texture here, which looks like this. If I wanted to generate a normal map for this texture, I could select this map and press Ctrl D or Command D on the keyboard to duplicate it, and we get Unity ask us, do we want to save these assets? I'm just going to choose Save All. Then we get a duplicate created here. I'm going to rename this duplicate to grass_n for normal. So now it's being classified here as a normal map. I'm going to select this texture, and I'm going to change the texture type from advanced to normal map, and I'm going to choose create from grayscale, which means that it's going to convert this image to grayscale and then change it to a normal map. So I'm going to scroll down and choose apply, and now we get a normal map, but right now it's very noisy, which means that it's going to be very, very bumpy. So I'm going to reduce the bumpiness by moving down here to the bumpiness slider in the Object Inspector and just slide this to the left, something like this, and then go back down and choose apply, and Unity will produce a different looking normal map. So now I have a normal map for this grass texture here. So I'm going to select the terrain again and click on the Edit Textures button and choose Add Texture. So we have the Add Terrain texture box. I'm going to click and drag this texture, the grass texture, into the albedo slot here, and I'm going to click and drag the normal map we generated into the normal slot here, like so. Now the size of this tile here, this pattern, this grass pattern, is going to be tiled in a pattern across this terrain, and this size determines the size in the size here over the terrain, so in meters, that the tile will cover. I'm going to choose 75, actually I'm going to choose 45, make it a little bit smaller, 45, and then choose Add. And when I do that, this base texture then is pasted or filled across this terrain. So now our terrain has a grassy appearance to it, and things are looking good. I can just zoom in and see the layout of that terrain, and in fact you can see the bumpiness of this grass where this normal map is being applied. So that's a great way to apply a base texture, but of course we want to paint some variation of the terrain, paint some of these textures over the top of this, and we'll see how to do that next. Next I want to add some additional brushes to this terrain that we can paint over the top of the base grass texture. And to do that I can just simply click on Edit Textures again and choose Add Texture. And this time I'm going to add this cliff grass texture. I'm going to set this again to a tile size of 45 by 45. I'm going to leave the normal map empty and just choose Add. So again we get that texture added. I'm then going to repeat that procedure, choose Add Texture, and this time I'm going to drag and drop the mud texture in here, set this again to a size of 45 by 45, and choose Add. And one more, I'm going to choose Edit Textures, Add Texture, and drag and drop the moss texture, and set that to a texture of 45 by 45, and choose Add. So we get this palette of different textures we can select. You can tell which texture is selected because a blue line is drawn underneath it. So right now this base grass texture is selected. What I want to do now is to come in and start painting this texture over the top of the grass. So I'm going to select it by just clicking on it with my mouse. I'm going to select that, and straight away a blue line is drawn underneath it to say, hey, I'm selected. The next thing I want to do is to select a shape of a brush for the painting operation. I'm going to choose this rougher brush here as opposed to a soft round brush. So I'm going to select this rougher brush instead. I'm going to increase the brush size, and again these settings work just the same as they do for terrain sculpting. So I'm going to increase the brush size and come here into the viewport and start clicking on the terrain. And when I do that, straight away you can see the new terrain style being painted over the top here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce here the opacity of my brush. So I'm going to reduce the opacity a little bit here. And I'm also going to reduce the target strength. The target strength represents the maximum opacity that the brush can reach, and the opacity here represents the actual opacity of the brush not exceeding this target strength. So I'm going to set it to something like that, and straight away you can see that we're getting a partial revealing of the terrain. Let's just increase the target strength just a little bit to increase the intensity here. So I'm having a kind of smooth blend between these two regions. So smoothly blending. Let's just maximize the scene viewport. I'm creating a smooth blend between the terrain here, the grass terrain, and this rocky terrain. So I'm going to have this kind of terrain over here in the corner. And from ground level it looks actually quite nice. So I'm just going to restore this view here and choose this muddy texture instead. I'm going to increase the target strength a little bit and the opacity to kind of paint this dirt texture over here on this side. I'm going to maximize the target strength and the opacity to create this corner fully as part of this dirt terrain here. So let's paint this over here. Let's increase the brush size a little bit to paint this bold area over here. And I'm going to just block in some basic areas. So I'm going to select this other brush here, and I'm going to block in an area for this here, like so. I'm going to increase this area a little bit as well, maybe around about this size, and just paint in some grass through this area. So I'm just blocking in the basic areas of the terrain, and then afterwards I can come back in and start to handle the blending between the different regions. So I'm happy with some sort of arrangement like this, and now I can come back in and start to tweak the opacity settings to create a blend between the different regions here in the environment. So I'm going to select this brush here and reduce the target strength and paint on something like this here. Let's just increase that a little bit just to create a bit of a blend, a bit of a better blend between the two areas, like this. It's looking better. And maybe this one as well, so just reduce the opacity here to create a kind of blend between these two environments. Same thing here. It just requires a bit of time and a bit of dedication, just creating these blends and getting the terrain to look exactly as you need it. So I'm kind of happy. I'm going to leave it there for now. That shows you the basics of how to begin painting these different terrain areas onto your terrain using these textures. So when you finally arrived at a configuration that you like, you're ready to move on to the next step. Now, before moving further with the terrain, I think it'd be kind of nice if we could explore it using a first-person controller, and here I want to show you how you can do that. So we go up here to the Assets menu, and I'm going to choose Import Package and then choose Characters. So I'm going to select Characters, and I'm just going to leave all of these settings at their defaults and just choose Import, like so. Unity will run ahead and analyze all of these assets and import them. They will all be added to the standard assets folder, which is already here in the Unity project. So I'm going to wait for that to import and then move down here to the project panel, double click on the standard assets, and under here where it says characters, I'm going to double click characters, and here under the first person controller, you can see in the prefabs folder, finally we have FPS controller. I'm going to drag and drop that into the scene. Let's just focus on that here by pressing F on the keyboard. I'm going to switch to the translate tool and just pull the character up above the ground level here to something like that. Now we have a first person controller added here, and for the first time I guess we kind of get an idea about the sheer scale of the terrain. If we look at just how large this first person controller is in comparison to the rest of the terrain, even a terrain at 256 by 256 is really quite enormous. The next thing I want to do is to select the main camera that we have been using. Just select that and delete it, because we don't need to use that camera anymore because we have a camera already attached to the FPS controller. So I'm going to press delete, and with that done now I'm going to press play on the toolbar, and in the game tab we can now explore the terrain in first person mode. And notice that actually the first person controller comes with some sound assets. So straight away we can hear footsteps on the character controller. These are not quite the footsteps that are ideal for this kind of terrain, but nevertheless they are footstep sounds, and we're going to be seeing sounds and how they work shortly. But now we have the ability to import this first-person controller, and now we can wander the terrain entirely, scanning the entire environment. So that's a kind of fun way to get up and running with terrain using the first-person controller, but still the terrain is a little bare. And next we're going to start to decorate that terrain, and I want to show how to get started using that by adding some water. So now it's time to add some water to our scene, and we can do that really easily. I'm going to move down here to the project panel, double click in the standard assets folder. I'm going to move to the environment folder, and I'm going to move to the water folder, and then we have water and water 4. Well, I'm going to choose water 4. And then inside the water 4 folder, we have the prefabs folder. So I'm going to go inside the prefabs folder, and finally we get here with water 4 simple or water 4 advanced. Well, hey, let's just choose the water 4 advanced. So I'm going to drag and drop that into the scene, and straight away you can see in the viewport that we're getting water in the level. So I'm going to click and release my mouse, and it's added here as water 4 advanced. It also adds this other object here. Both of these are required for the water. I'm going to just expand the scene tab and position my water somewhere in the level, maybe, I don't know, somewhere like that. So we're getting some water. You can see the water between the rocks. It's actually looking quite nice here. But over here in the terrain, what you see is the water above the terrain level. So I'm going to just tweak the terrain around that. So let's just grab the water again. So I'm going to select the water, maybe just move this out to around about here. And now I can just raise the terrain up a little bit. Actually, maybe I could just pull that over here. And let's just take a look around the edges. So there's nothing there. That's fine. That's fine. This side looking good. That side. So we just need to tweak the terrain here on this side. To do that, I'm going to select the terrain. I'm going to choose the terrain sculpt tools, and I'm just going to elevate, just shrink my brush a little bit and just elevate the terrain in here just to hide the edges of the water there. And I think that's looking pretty nice. Let's just do the same just there on that side. Now that I have changed the terrain, it is important to save the terrain asset. If you've made changes to the terrain and you don't save the terrain asset, then the first person controller will determine its collisions wrongly. It will end up being able to walk through parts of the terrain that you have changed. So press Ctrl S on the keyboard to get this dialog, and just choose Save All. That will save the collision data in the terrain asset since we have changed it. I'm now going to select the play button on the toolbar, and we can wander around the level. And actually I could be a long way off from my water. I think I can see it over here actually. Let's just run over this side, and yes, and there we have the water in our scene, and it's looking quite nice. We've got water up and running, and it's looking good. So that's the basics of how you can get water up and running in a Unity scene very easily. Now I want to add some trees to the terrain, and to do this I'm going to be using the asset package that we imported from the asset store. So I'm going to double click on the terrain assets folder, and in the trees ambient folder you will see that we have a range of different tree meshes that we can use. Now if I select these tree meshes, you will see from the object inspector that generate colliders is not enabled for any of these trees, which means that if we add them to the terrain, the player is going to be able to walk through them. So I want to correct for that straight away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag and drop a tree into the scene. So I'm just going to position it here. Right now it really doesn't matter where I position this tree. So I'm going to select this one, for example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a collider to it. So I'm going to choose Component, Physics, and I'm going to choose Capsule Collider. So I'm going to select that from the menu, and straight away Unity tries to approximate the volume of this tree. You can see the collider gizmo wrapping around the object, approximating the area that the player cannot pass through. I'm going to narrow this by changing the radius setting to maybe something like that, so it's long and narrow and approximates the trunk of the tree, the player is never really going to be able to walk all the way up here. So that's about all I need to do. Now, to save this configuration, this tree model with the new collision data, I'm going to create a prefab object which allows us to collect together multiple objects in the scene. So I'm going to go over here to the Assets panel, and I'm going to right click and choose Create and then choose Prefab, and I'm going to call this Tree Prefab like so. It's a completely empty prefab. We can see that because we have a grey cube here, and what I'm going to do is just simply drag and drop this object into the prefab like so. And now when I select that prefab, you can see here in the object inspector, if I scroll down, it stores the capsule collider information. So this works just like any other regular asset. If I select this tree and delete it and drag and drop it into the scene, every single one of these instances has the capsule collider enabled. So I'm going to select this tree, delete it, select this tree, delete it, and this one, delete it. The terrain mesh here gives us a really easy feature for adding trees. So I'm going to select the terrain object in the scene and move over to the Trees tab, which is this tab here. I'm going to select the Trees tab, and under the trees, just as with painting textures, we get to select a tree brush. So I'm going to choose Edit Trees and then choose Add Tree. I'm going to drag and drop my prefab into this slot here to add my tree, and then just choose Add. So now we have that tree selected, and we can select the brush size, the density of the trees to paint, and this tree height will allow Unity to select a random height for each tree, and we can even use this min and max slider here to select the minimum and the maximum range in which the tree height can fluctuate. So the left slider represents the minimum height for a tree, and the right slider represents the maximum height for a tree, and Unity will pick a height between that range at random. We can also randomize the colors of the tree and also the rotation of the tree. Now we can see that the tree is really going to be in this green vegetation area, so I'm just going to reduce my brush size just a little bit, and then just click and drag, and then suddenly we can start painting trees on the terrain here. I'm just going to reduce the density just a little bit and paint some extra trees over on this side here. And there we have now some trees added to the scene. I'm just going to press Shift Spacebar to maximize this view here, and now you can see the trees that we have added to the scene, and that's actually looking pretty nice. We've added these trees into the level. Press Shift Spacebar on the keyboard, and now if I go into the Game tab and I press play on the toolbar, let's just maximize this view by Shift Space and press play on the toolbar, you can see now these trees have been added to the level and we can't walk through them. These trees are physical objects, and notice also that in the background the Unity has calculated the shadows for these trees, and they've been projected onto the ground surface, so we have shadows for each of these trees on the surface of the terrain. So finally we've got trees on the terrain and things are looking good. Let's move on by adding some rocks. Now it's time to paint some grass and rocks onto the terrain that we have here. So I'm going to revisit the Terrain Assets folder that we've seen before and open up the Rocks folder here, and you can see if I select this in the project panel that we have a rock mesh, and we can see that here in the Object Inspector. So what I want to do is to paint this rock mesh onto the terrain to create some rocks that are scattered around. To do this, I'm going to select the Terrain object here in the Hierarchy panel, and from the Object Inspector I'm going to add the Paint Details tab that you can see here. And just as with trees and with textures, we can paint mesh objects onto the terrain. The Paint Details tab is generally used for any meshes that we want to add to the terrain that isn't a tree. So down here on the Edit Details button, I'm going to click on that button and choose Add Detail Mesh. And from this dialog, Add Detail Mesh, I'm going to drag and drop the rock mesh into the detail group. These settings from Noise Spread down to max height I'm going to leave at default. The healthy and dry color I am going to change because this really is applicable to vegetation. For rock meshes I'm just going to set the healthy color to white and the dry color to a gray. For the render mode, I'm going to change that from grass to vertex lit and then choose add. And you can see the rock mesh appears here in the details panel. And all I need to do now is to select a brush. So I'm going to use this brush here, these dotted brushes. And I'm going to change my brush size, just maybe a little bit like that. And what I can do then is start to paint into the terrain to start to add rock meshes about the environment. So something like this, click and drag here and paint some of these rocks into the terrain. You'll notice that as I zoom out, the rocks are being hidden, and this is an optimization feature. You can change the zoom out distance over here in the settings panel by selecting that. You can change the distance by using the detail distance, which is here, which tells you the distance that the camera has to be from the terrain before these objects are hidden from view. So I'm just going to go back to the Paint Details tab and just paint on a few more rocks into the terrain here, like so, and a few more through here. So I've added enough rocks to this terrain. I also want to add some grass, and we can do that down here by using the Edit Details button. So I'm going to choose Edit Details and then Add Grass Texture. But first let's find a grass texture. I'm going to go down here to the Terrain Assets and select Textures. And again, we've seen these textures. Actually, the textures we need are not in here. They are in this grass folder. So if I select grass, you can see we have a range of different grasses that we can use. So I'm going to choose Edit Details, Add Grass Texture, and I'm going to move this into view here. And I'm going to drag and drop, let's say, this grass texture into here. I'm going to leave all of these at defaults and then just choose Add. So now we have a rock mesh and we also have a grass texture. So I'm going to select that grass texture and move into this green and verdant area here. So let's just get a better view on this area, and I can just start to paint in some grass texture. I'm actually going to increase the brush size a little bit, increase the opacity just to add slightly denser. Actually, I don't think I want it quite that dense. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that. Let's just reduce the opacity a bit more. So we're getting something like this. Let's just increase it a bit more and reduce the brush size. So something like this is a bit better. So I'm going to start to paint some grass into here and paint some grass over here, like so. Some more grass over this side, some more grass over here, some more grass over here. So I'm creating a kind of grassy plain inside here. Just zoom out and paint some more grass over to this side here. So I've added some basic grass to this area here. Now let's give this a test run. I'm going to switch to the Game tab and press play. Actually, I'm going to maximize the Game tab first with Shift Spacebar and press play on the toolbar. And when I do that, if you look carefully, you can see from the panel here that this grass is automatically swaying in the wind. It's using the wind effects of the terrain to just sway that grass back and forth. So that's kind of a nice effect that we've added there to this grassy terrain. And what we've done in seeing this, we've seen the basics of adding a terrain. We've now added grass, rock textures, trees. We've also added water, and we've managed to texture paint our terrain just how we like it. So we've actually seen an impressive range of terrain features that really are quite nice. Now it's time for us to move on. Now before moving forwards, I just wanted to show you how easy it is in Unity to create day and night cycles for your terrains. So what you can see here in Unity is the Game tab arranged up here with a view of the terrain scene. And down here I have docked the Scene tab just so that I have a good view of the directional light in the scene. So we have this directional light that you can see here in the scene. I'm just going to switch to the global mode so that I can control the rotation of the light. And over here in the hierarchy panel, you can see that the directional light is selected. Now I can control the day and night cycle, the time of day, simply by rotating the directional light to control its position in the scene. So I'm just going to press play on the toolbar here, and you can see the scene is running away here. The grass is swaying in the wind, and I can control the day and night simply by controlling the rotation of the light. And notice how in the Game tab the lighting is updating. The shadows are moving, and if I rotate it and I continue to rotate it downwards and downwards and downwards, you can see that we start to create a sunset scenario here in the scene. So you can see in the distance the sun is setting behind that tree, and we're getting a sunset scenario, and then finally everything goes down to complete darkness, and now we get a night scene. Now you can see that the leaves on the trees, they are not currently darkening, and that is simply because the default material associated with them is not affected by the light in the scene, but everything else is darkening. And so we can control the day and night cycle simply by rotating that directional light in the scene. So that's pretty clever and a nice neat feature of Unity 5. So now we've created our terrains and we're ready to move on and take a look at Unity's new audio features. In this movie I want to get started with the Unity audio functionality for playing music and sound effects in your games. What I have open here is the Terrain Audio project, and you can find this in the course companion files in the Terrain Audio folder. Now the Unity 5 engine has an update and we've got new audio features and lots of them. It's quite a detailed and complex audio system. In this module of the course we'll just be exploring the very basics for playing sound effects and music for our game. So the first thing I want to talk about is the concept of an audio source and an audio listener. In Unity we can hear sound because of audio listener components. In fact, under the component menu, and if we move down to where it says audio, we have audio listener and audio source. These are a core duo of components. If I select the first person controller in the scene and I expand this object and I select the first person character, which is really a camera in the scene, if I double click the first person character, you can see that we have this camera object in the scene here. And indeed we have a camera component if we look at the object in the object inspector. But further down we have an audio listener object. This represents a pair of ears in the scene, so this is what can hear sound. If we were to take the tick out of the audio listener, then we would effectively turn the sound completely off in our game. But I'm going to put a tick here to enable this audio listener, and this locates the ears in the game to this camera component. Now there is a rule in Unity that you cannot have more than one audio listener component in the scene at any one time. There can't be two or more audio listeners active in the scene at any one time. Now this kind of makes it awkward for developing two-player split screen games in which we need two different ears at two different locations at the same time, but that's a completely separate issue. Right now, it's just important to bear in mind that we have to have an audio listener to hear sound. So if I press play on the toolbar and I walk around, we can hear the footstep sounds for the first person controller, but if I disable the audio listener, we can't hear anything at all because I have deactivated sound. So I'm going to stop playback and this audio listener is returned back to its initial state. Now the footstep sounds are created by an audio source component. These are components that can create sounds. So if I select the first person controller object and I scroll down in the object inspector, you see that we have an audio source component for playing sound effects. And when I press play to play back the game, you can see in the audio clip field that we have the sound effect that is currently being played right now. So we're going between footstep 1, footstep 2, footstep 1, footstep 2, and if I jump, we're going to get a jump sound being fed into the audio source component there. So we're playing a jump sound. So that's the basics of the audio system. We have audio listeners and audio sources. Next, what I want to do is to use an audio source to create a background music track for our game. Now I want to import a music track into the game that we can use as a backing track for our level. So I'm just going to move the Unity window out of the way here and just bring in this track that you can see here. This audio file is provided for you in the course companion files, full speed, full loop, and I'm just going to drag and drop that into the Unity project panel. And when we do that, Unity is going to import the asset and configure it. So the asset has now been loaded. I'm just going to bring the Unity window back here to fill the recording window. And I'm going to select the audio asset that we've imported here. And it's already configured this for loading. Because this is a music track, I'm going to really say compressed in memory. Keep this track compressed in memory. This is better for longer music tracks. So I'm going to select that there. And I'm just going to choose apply, like so. And you can see down here in the Object Inspector in the preview panel that we have the waveform for the audio, and we can even preview the audio by pressing the play button here in the Object Inspector. So that's a sample of the music file there. Now, to add this to the scene so that it plays back, we need to create a new empty game object. So I'm going to choose Game Object, Create Empty, or I could press Ctrl-Shift-N. So I'm going to select that. I'm just going to call this object Music. So I'm going to select this in the name here and choose Music. And I'm just going to reset this to the world origin. So that object now is at the world origin, which is right here. And all this empty object has is a transform component. For this to make a sound, it needs to have an audio source component. So I'm going to choose component and audio and then audio source, like so. And here we have an audio source component. The audio clip here, this field represents the audio that we want to play, and I want to play the music track. So I'm going to drag and drop the music track into the audio clip field like this. Now I want this audio file to play automatically when the level begins. So I have to make sure there is a tick in the box here that says play on awake, and indeed there is a tick in that box. I'm also going to tick the loop box because when the background track finishes playing, I want it to loop around and start playing again continually. So to do that, you should enable the loop option. Now here under the field Spatial Blend, we have the opportunity to change this value from 2D to a fully 3D sound. Now what this means is when the sound is fully 3D, then it means that this sound is located in space inside the level, so that as the player moves nearer to it, the sound will grow louder, and as the player moves further away, the sound will fade out. And when you get too far away from the sound, you won't hear it at all. We don't really want that effect to apply to a music track. A music track should be constantly audible so long as it's playing. So I want to make sure the spatial blend is not on 3D, but that we move it to the 2D setting like this. And now, so long as this first person character has an audio listener component enabled, when I press play on the toolbar, the music track will play back automatically. So let's try that by pressing play. And now in the background, you can hear the music track playing. And so now we have a complete music track for our game. So things are looking good. We now have a music track for our game as well as footsteps. Let's move on. In this movie I want to demonstrate 3D or positional sound in Unity, that sound whose volume varies depending on the position of the audio listener. So to get started doing that, I want to find an audio asset that we can use, and I will use one that's included in the standard asset packages. I could drill down through all these different folders, but I just want to quickly search for the asset that I need, and to do that I can use the search tab here in the project panel. So to search for an asset, in particular an audio clip asset, I can type in this search box. I can begin with the letter T and then colon. That indicates that I want to search for a particular type of asset, and I want to find an audio clip. And when I type that, straight away Unity searches for all the audio clips and then displays them together regardless of the folders they may be in. I want to play the jump sound, so I'm going to select the jump sound, and in the Object Inspector I can preview that just by pressing the play button on the toolbar there, and there's the sound. Now I could add this to the scene just as we added the music by choosing Game Object, Create Empty, and then by choosing Component, Audio and Audio Source, but I'm not going to do that. I can do something a bit quicker. I can drag and drop the jump sound into the hierarchy panel, and it's already added now as an object in the level. It's already configured. I'm going to double click on that jump object and straight away it's added at the world origin. I'm just going to raise that up and bring this into the level. Just raise it up here, press F on the keyboard. Let's just bring this over here, raise this up a little, and the first person controller you can see is over here. So I'm going to position it near the first person controller and just raise it down here by the water side. So around about there-ish, I think that's looking pretty good. Let's just raise it up just a little bit so here we can see it by the water side. So there is our sound. Now we have to make sure that this is a 3D sound and not a 2D sound. So we're going to go to the Object Inspector and change the spatial blend from 2D to completely 3D. I'm also going to enable the loop checkbox because I want this sound to play on a loop. And I'm also going to make sure that play on awake is checked so that the sound plays when the level begins. Now down here at the bottom we also have a 3D sound setting group which we can expand and scroll down to see these settings in more detail. We have this graph here too. Now I'm going to change the volume roll-off setting. This controls how the volume decreases as the player moves further away. I want to change this from logarithmic. I'm going to set this to linear. And what this does is it controls how the volume declines as the player moves away. You can see we have listener here, which indicates where the player is standing right now in relation to the sound. We have this max distance setting which specifies the maximum distance in meters, and when the player moves beyond this distance the sound level will be at 0. So I'm going to click and drag on the max distance field to reduce the max distance, and I'm going to reduce this quite considerably. So way down here. Okay, so now as I start to get to lower values you can see the graph beginning to change. And in the viewport here, you can see the radius around the sound expanding as I change this setting here. So I'm going to move the setting to around about here. And you can see already that the position of the listener is here. And as we play our game, the position of the listener will vary in relation to the sound. And this tells you the volume of the sound as the listener moves around. So I'm going to press the play button on the toolbar. And as I move nearer to the water, the sound is going to get louder. You can see here in this section the listener's moving nearer. And now I'm moving further away. And now I'm fully beyond the distance. I'm going to move nearer. And then further away. Nearer. And then further. So that's the basics of how positional sound works in Unity, and it's very important. I now want to consider an audio feature that is new to Unity 5, and that is the audio mixer window. This window gives us high-level control over the volume levels of different types of sound in the game, as well as to apply special effects to different sounds. Now to get started using the audio mixer, we have to create an audio mixer asset. To do that, we can move down here to the project panel, right-click, and from the menu choose Create and Audio Mixer. And I'm going to name this Main Mixer. Now to display the contents of this Main Mixer asset, we can double click on the Main Mixer asset from here, or we can display the Audio Mixer window by choosing Window, Audio Mixer, or press Ctrl 8 on the keyboard. That's Command 8 on a Mac. But I'm going to double click the Main Mixer asset, and when I do that it displays here in the Audio Mixer window. This window may appear free-floating. It may appear, for example, up here or over here. If it does, just click and drag the Audio Mixer tab and drop it down the bottom here. This view is usually quite good. So here we have a master mixer channel that has been added automatically to the audio mixer, and this will display the volume levels for us in our game. So I'm going to press the play button on the toolbar. And when I do that, you can see that although we do hear sound and music in the game, nothing is displaying in this master channels area here. And the reason for that is because we have to route the audio in our game through one of these channels. So I'm going to select the music asset here in the level, and you can see in the audio source component we have an output setting that allows us to map this setting, this audio, through a particular channel in the audio mixer. So for the output setting, I'm going to click on this box here to display the audio mixer group selector, and I'm going to select the master channel that you can see here in the main mixer. So I'm going to select the master channel and close this now. And when I press play on the toolbar, now you can hear the music playing and it's going through this master channel. And in fact, I can now change the volume level of the game simply by clicking this Edit in Play mode. And if I select the master mixer here, in the object inspector we can see the volume level, and I can reduce the volume level of the game, the master volume this is, by clicking and dragging this slider down, bringing it right down to the bottom. We mute the sound entirely, but I'm just going to restore this back to 0 here. And the sound now has been restored to its ordinary levels. So we are routing the master volume through here. Notice that if I set the master volume to the lowest setting here on the slider, and I still walk around, I can still hear the footsteps. And the reason is because the footstep sounds are not being routed through the master channel. If I wanted to mute those as well, I would have to select the FPS controller, and down here in the audio source component, I would have to specify the output for this also as the master channel. So now when I press play and the game plays, I can select the master channel, make sure Edit in Play mode is enabled, and now I can raise this volume up and I can hear the sound and the music playing, and I can also mute it and hear absolutely nothing because all the audio now is being routed through the master channel. So that's the basics of how to get up and running using channels in the audio mixer. In this movie, I want to add additional channels to the audio mixer so that we have independent control over the volume levels of music and sound effects, making it possible to reduce the volume of the music while keeping the volume of the sound effects, and vice versa. So to do that, I'm going to move over here to the audio mixer window, and over here in the groups section we have master, but I'm going to add 2 new groups. So I'm going to select master and then click the plus icon, and a new group is added as a child of the master. So ultimately the master volume level is going to control and override the volume level of its child. So I'm going to call this group music, and I'm going to select the master again and click plus to create another child of the master group, and I'm going to call this SFX for sound effects. So we have 2 groups here, music and sound effects, and these are children of the master channel, so that if I were to reduce the volume of the master channel, that would kind of cancel out the music and the sound effects. But if I reduce the volume of the music channel, it wouldn't really affect the master or the sound effects. So we have these 3 channels now, and what I want to do is go into the scene and select the music object. And for the music object, for its output, I'm going to route that here to the music channel. So that's going to be going through the music channel. And for the first person controller, I'm going to scroll down to the sound effect footstep assets here in the output. And instead of routing that to the master channel, I'm going to route that to the sound effects channel. So we have the music going to the music channel, the sound effects going to the sound effects channel. And now when I play the game, you can see that we have music and sound effects playing in unison, but each is going to their own channels. So if I go Edit in Play mode, for example, and I reduce the volume of the music, we can't hear any music at all playing, but we can still hear the sound effects. And likewise, I can reduce the volume of the sound effects and go back to the music and increase the volume of the music. And actually, let's just put that back to 0 and increase the volume of the music. And now we can hear the music but not the sound effects. And again, I can return the volume level to the sound effects back to normal so we can hear the music and the sound effects. But if I go to the master channel and I set the volume way down, we can't hear anything playing at all, because the master channel is ultimately overriding the volume of the music and the sound effects. So that basically is how multiple channels can work in unison inside the audio mixer to give you complete control over different audio sources in your scene. And this represents really a basic introduction to both the terrain assets and the audio functionality that are part of Unity 5. So this has been 3dmotive.com, and I've been Alan Thorne. I hope you found this part really helpful to your projects. And what I want to do in the next part is to consider physically based rendering and materials.